Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to continue on with Chapter 6 from Eloquent JavaScript by Merjan Haverbeek. Talking today about the getters, setters, and statics, something that we have seen a lot if you program in something like Java. When you create your classes, you have getters, setters, along with your constructor. A lot of times, I kind of forget that you can do the same thing in JavaScript. So we're going to talk about getters, setters, and statics. If you guys remember last time, we talked about the iterator interface and the benefits of using an iterator interface, which is basically putting a property of an iterator that returns an iterable that then allows you to loop through things within an object. And it's something that you create when you create your very own object. So check out that video from last week. Really cool way to loop through items from an object. But today, we're going to talk about getters, setters, and statics. And let's go to the first slide. As this loads up, like I said, this is something that we've seen in Java. Let me just make sure. Okay. Yep, there we go. Something that we've seen in Java, but you can do the same thing in JavaScript. So interfaces in JavaScript can contain methods. Now, they can also consist of properties too. So we see this whenever we see a dot notation, like if you say like your string dot length or dot size, something like that. That's the property. So the properties hold non-function values. Like I said, it's like the size or length property. In this case of a map, you use your map.size. You're going to get the number of key value pairs in that map. Those are functions. They are properties. They hold non-function values. But you do have methods too. Like if you call .toString, that is a function. You could say that that's a method of that interface of that class or what have you. But oftentimes you can call a property using the dot notation, but under the hood, it is a getter. So it's a method that acts like a property and it returns a value, kind of like your getters in like a plain Spring Boot project. You have a Java project, you have a get maybe you have like a car class, you have get weight, and the weight just returns an integer, right? Same thing here in JavaScript. Actually, let me go back one last slide. Yep, there we go. So you have getters, which are defined by a get keyword. You actually have to specify a get keyword. This isn't something that is within the method name, although you probably could name it with a get. Started out with like get something, but it has to be prefaced by a get keyword. You don't have to define the property with the word get, though. This is kind of what I was just mentioning. And it's a way to retrieve a property of an object. On the next slide, we see an example of this. We have a person object with two attributes called first name and last name, John Doe. And then we define a getter within this object, which you can see there is prefaced by the word get. And the function name here is full name. So this is going to return a template string with the first name and the last name. So when you print out person.fullname at the bottom, you're going to print out John Doe. These are the first and last name attributes assigned to person. So you can see you have to use the get keyword in order to define this as a getter. And then when you call it, you just use the dot notation. You don't have to say get full name. Although you can definitely name this function however you want it, but this is a getter. So another example of this, and you can see a setter in this situation. We'll talk about setters in the next slide, but here we have a class. In the previous slide, we had an object that we created, but it works in the same fashion. We have a class circle here in JavaScript, and we define two getters that will return the radius and it will return the area. And now on the next slide, when we call, let's say myCircle.radius, or excuse me, well, yeah, when we call myCircle.radius, it's going to output the radius that is given in the constructor of this circle. Now, you also see that there's a setter here, and the setter is of the same name. You have a setter and a getter of radius. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, but you can actually then assign a radius a number using the same dot notation like they do here. MyCircle.radius, you're going to set it to -3, but you can't have it be -3 because in the setter method, we're only looking for stuff that's above 0 with a positive value. So instead, you set it to 8. So up here, it might print 5, but down here, it's going to print 8. So this is a way to both reuse the same method name as both a getter and a setter. Like in Java, you would have get radius, and then you'd have set radius. And here, yes, you would still define them differently, but you can just leave the name as is, which leads us to setters. So setters allow you to assign a property value in an object, or I guess in a class too, and it's used by the set keyword. Much like how you use the get keyword, you have to use set and then your method name. And like I said, you can get and set to the same property. Just make sure that you don't get confused when you do that, and you make sure that, I guess it wouldn't be too confusing because you will know when something's an assignment versus when something is, hey, just print this. And I think, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to talk about the advantage of using a getter and a setter. So in here, Celsius uses both a getter and a setter, and it's called in the same way. So here, we're updating the temperature in Celsius using the setter. Now, this stems from the previous slide where we have a temperature class, and in the constructor, we're taking in a Celsius degree measurement. You can see that here, and then this ._Celsius, that's basically a way to say that it's a private variable. I don't really know if it's used like that anymore in JavaScript, but that's just saying that, okay, Celsius is a private variable. Next slide. And then we have, let me go back. Then you have your getter and your setter here, right? Go to the next slide. And you assign Celsius, the Celsius variable, this number of 25, right? So when you print it here, it's going to print 25. And then to call the setter, you would just still use that same dot notation and then assign it to a new number 30. So when you say my temperature.Celsius and you try to print it, it's going to print 30 now. So you see if you use the setter, you're going to have to assign it, use the equal sign, assign it to something. But when you want to use the getter, you just use the dot notation. Next and lastly, we have static. So what's a static? It's a keyword used with methods that belong to a class, just like in Java. When you see the static keyword, the method belongs to the class, and you don't have to create new instances of that class to use that method. So it's written before the method, just like get and set. And these methods are then attached to the constructor. Like I said, similar like in Java, so you don't have to create an object in order to use the methods. I know I just said that earlier, but repeating it again. It's good to use when you don't need instance-specific data. Good to use when you need a constant. Or if you have complex logic involved in creating an object, you can have a factory method set as a static to then create an object. This is called like the factory pattern. Or you can use static methods as just a singleton pattern to create just one instance of that class. So there's specific uses for this. You're not going to want to use it all the time, but there's some specific uses for it. And one of them is here. Here we have a factory method where we create a car from a license plate. So we have the static method defined here. It's going to take in a license plate, and it's going to return a new car based on some complex logic of extracting the make and model from the license plate. It's going to assign it to two variables and then use those two variables in the making of a new car. So how you would call this is just you would say car.create from license plate, and then you enter in like a complex string or something like that. That's one example. And sorry, I don't really have this method in use, but you can just imagine you would say car.create from license plate instead of having to create a new car Ford and then call Ford.create from license plate. You would just say car.create from license plate. Same thing from here in the singleton pattern. When you want to just create one instance of your class, so when you have the singleton class, you just call singleton.getInstance, and this will create a new instance of the singleton class, and it'll only ever create one because if you can see the logic here, we're checking if this is null. If it's null, we're creating the singleton. If it's not null, then we're not going to create the singleton. We're just going to return the singleton that already exists. And that's where this keyword, this has to deal with like this instance of this class. We see that also in Java entities, especially like in Spring Boot. So some ways to use a static method. The benefits. How about the benefits of using getters and setters? Well, they allow you to attach other logic when accessing or trying to set data or values in your object. Basically, they encapsulate and they hide data or values you don't want anybody else to see. So you can have, like, you guys remember the first slide, right? This is like the most basic example. When we're returning full name, we can return like our own customized screen. Hey, the full name is John Doe, right? We can really customize the data that is returned from this getter, right? And that's kind of one of the benefits of using a getter. Whereas, if you just want to return like just like the first name, right? Maybe you want to return something more complicated. You want to return like a greeting or a salutation to the first name so you can really customize the string that it returns. So that's kind of what it's getting at as the one of the benefits of using getters or setters. You can encapsulate the data. You can hide the inner workings, data or values that you don't want anybody else to see. And also you can do validation in a getter or setter, like we saw in the example before. I think it was here in the radius on the left-hand side. When you try to assign a -3, we can then actually validate this to make sure that it's above 0. So that's another advantage of using getters and setters, is to attach validation to these methods to only return values of an appropriate value that's consistent with what you're setting. So in this example, we have a setter called name. So whenever you input a string here, the string value has to be greater than 3 characters. You can't have Tim, right? You can't have Tim or Joe, J-O. It's got to be like Chris, Stephanie, Jonathan, or else it'll return this error. Drawbacks? Not really. Nothing that I could really find. I guess it's just convention. If your team isn't used to using getters and setters, then don't really use them, although they're not really that confusing to use. But they could get confusing if you do have complex logic, like you do have complex validation in a setter, or you do have a complex method pattern. Maybe a static might be confusing to use, or maybe a setter might be confusing when you don't exactly know what a valid value to pass into the setter is, and you always get errors when trying to set properties of your object or class. There's really not a lot of drawbacks. It's just convention. It's what your team is used to and what the team agrees on. So I find that that's a cool way to do some just extra work behind the scenes and really encapsulate data in JavaScript. Personally, I don't really use these that much. We really, on my project, we really only used our front end app as, I don't want to say lightweight, but we make the back heavy lifting in regards to creating objects or having classes that map to our database, etc. We don't really do that on JavaScript sides, but not to say that you can't, as you just saw today. So that's going to do it for today, guys. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions on this episode or any of the other episodes. And we'll be back next time with another topic from Chapter 6. Check out the podcast. I've got a new full interview coming out with Todd Palmer. Really great guy, fun conversation. So my name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.